Hi, my name's Mel and welcome back to Bookish Brummie. So for today's video we're going to be looking in depth at a book called The People in the Trees by Hanya Yanagihara. So I'm going to say now just up front that there are going to be some spoilers in this video because this book is quite hard to discuss without discussing some of the bits that happen at the end. However, when I finished reading this book, or even before I finished reading this book, I was on Goodreads, I was on Reddit looking for reviews of this book because I was like halfway through the book and I couldn't even believe like what I was reading. So I think that we're going to have a fairly good discussion hopefully today about this book. Now, you may have heard of Hanya Yanagihara because she wrote A Little Life, which has been extremely well received over the last year or so. I think I've been seeing reviews for that pop up absolutely everywhere, and I personally haven't read it yet. But how I came about having The People in the Trees is because I wanted to buy A Little Life, and I saw like a book bundle where it had A Little Life and then another book that she wrote called To Paradise, and then this one, The People in the Trees, was in it, and essentially you could buy that bundle and you're essentially getting one of those books for free. So I'd read the premise for To Paradise, which is kind of like a dystopian from what I could tell, and then everybody's been raving about A Little Life. I'd never actually heard of The People in the Trees. So I was reading the back and then I did a little bit of looking online. I was trying to find out like what sort of genre it was so that I could shelve it on my bookcase, and it came back with this is sci-fi, this is speculative fiction, this is contemporary fiction, this is historical fiction, and I was like, okay, like don't really know what that is. So you know, in order to where to shelve it, so I just sort of opened the first few pages just as a brief read on the front in the front of the book, and it just pulled me into the book, honestly, and then I ended up reading the whole book. So I actually accidentally read it. I didn't mean to read it at this point, but the way that it was written was really well done. I mean, the prose was just beautiful, and just the way that the story was structured was really good. It starts off with like a prologue and then like ends with an epilogue, and I think that I read the prologue and I was like, okay, I really want to see like where this is going. So let's just start with some facts first. So this book was published in 2013 and it's Yanagihara's first novel, so it's her debut novel. So I'm really surprised at that because this was so perfectly written, and a sort of questions you end up asking yourself, like when you finish, well, even halfway through reading this book, before you've even finished reading this book, you know, it was very I don't know, I just feel like you're questioning yourself even when you think like, actually I'm quite comfortable that I've come up with the moral reasons why I think this will do this, and then you sort of like rethinking about it while you're reading this book, which I think is a really hard thing to get a reader to do. So the fact that she managed to do this on a debut novel was really good. So I'm actually really looking forward to reading the other two books now because I can see that this writer is really talented. The story is about a doctor who is called Dr. Abraham Norton Farina, but all through the book he's sort of referred to as Norton, and it's he's in Frederick Correctional Facility in prison, and he's reflecting back on his life up until the point where he's obviously ended up in prison. And when he's in prison, he's in his 70s, so he doesn't get arrested for his crime until he's in his 70s. And he's essentially a very successful doctor. He wasn't a practicing GP, if you like, throughout his career. He was more of he was a researcher, and in particular he was quite well known because he went off to study unknown tribes on small islands. But he'd gone out at the beginning of his career, he'd been sent out to a small island. It's a false island, like it's a fictive island set in Micronesia called Evu. I might be saying this wrong, but that's how I'm sort of reading it in my head. And on that island there is a tribe of people, and they are unseen and unknown by even the closest island to it. So they really haven't seen Westerners for, well, some of them may never have seen Westerners at all, and they haven't had anything to do with any of the mainland population or even the population on the island next to them. So they are living you know, a very I'd put like their lifestyle is completely native. They've got no electricity or anything like that. They are out like hunting for their food by hand every day, and you know, all the resources they have are resources that they can get on the island that they live on. Anyway, they have like this ceremony essentially, because it's really hard to age on the island, to be honest, because it's hard life. So if somebody gets to like the age of 60 years old, then they go through some ritual and they eat one of the local turtles, which is a specific breed. I can't say the name, if I'm honest, so I'm not going to try and say the name. But this seems to confer a sort of immortality on them. So there's actually islanders that are there that are like 300 years old. So it's quite incredible. And what our doctor does in his career is he takes samples of this turtle back to the States, and he also studies some subjects who are essentially classed as immortal, and he writes papers on it and discovers, like, names the virus that essentially they have got from this turtle, which has conferred this sort of immortality on them. And then he feeds bits of this turtle to mice subjects and dog subjects to try and understand, you know, how it's working. Because to be honest, when they found the subjects on the island, they actually worked on a different sort of calendar. So the Evuvians, they measure time in their calendar, which is 400 of our days to their 1 year. So you know, they're about 50 days odd longer than what the rest of the Western calendar is measuring time on. So you've sort of got that, which makes it a bit more difficult. And then obviously it's difficult because they don't necessarily sort of, they're not counting, I don't think they're counting the years, to be honest, after they get past the age of 60. Like when they're getting past about the age of 100, like they're not even counting them. So it's very difficult to be very specific determining the age of these much older island residents. So yeah, I had to go and do some studies back in the States after he'd left the island, you know. And then because of this, he actually won a Nobel Prize, you know, and it took him out of obscurity as a researcher and put him right in the forefront of, you know, the scientific community for his discoveries. So that's kind of like the plot of the story, in the sense of, you know, we start off with Norton. Like the book starts off in 1924, which is essentially when Norton is born, and it spans up until the beginning of the year 2000, when Norton gets out of prison, and that's when the story ends. So it spans over basically his whole lifetime, and we start off at the beginning of the book where Norton's just talking about his childhood, you know, and then his time at medicine school. And then obviously we've got a fair chunk of the book which he's talking about the expedition that he went on and who he was with. And then when he actually leaves the expedition, then, you know, him trying to settle back into American life. And then, you know, he'd adopted some children as well, so it sort of follows his experience of trying to be a parent, I think, and a working parent at that. So we've got a huge span for the story. What's actually happening which defined his career on the island is actually only really a small bit of the story. What the story is really about, I think, is about Norton's life. So he's writing his memoir, and he's been asked to write his memoir by Dr. Ronald Kubadura. And Kubadura was a man who was in Norton's lab, like working for him, you know, after he had come back from the island and had sort of received a lot of funding to be able to continue with his research. So he was one of the people that he'd hired from that. And basically the book opens up with a prologue which is written by Kubadura. And Kubadura is saying that essentially that Norton is one of the greatest scientists that ever lived. You know, he's a good friend of his, he has a lot of respect for him. Unfortunately, he is in prison for the sexual assault and abuse of a minor. But you know, he doesn't seem to believe that Norton has committed this crime, even though Norton has obviously been found guilty because he's in prison. And you know, in this prologue, he's sort of talking about how he's upset that all the people surrounding Norton, like his colleagues and his, you know, any friends that he might have had, and even his own brother, and even some of his adopted children, have sort of abandoned Norton in prison and don't want anything to do with him. And he just thought that that was a really sad affair, because he thinks that Norton is a really outstanding human being. So he had asked Norton, while you're, you know, in prison and you've got some quiet time, I think it would be really good if you wrote your memoirs of, you know, your life and your adventure. You know, and I think it's in a hope to get the public to look at Norton in a different way. So in this prologue as well, Kubadora is telling us that, you know, he's received, you know, this writing from Norton, and essentially he has edited it. So one thing I will say is, like, throughout the book you have footnotes. So once we get into obviously the first chapter where Norton starts talking about things, Kubadora is obviously editing it, so he'll put some footnotes in about, you know, to follow up on a point that Norton might have made, if he wants to be a bit more explicit about what Norton means, or if, like, Norton has mentioned that something was published in a paper, then Kubadora puts, you know, at the bottom, like, the name of the paper, like cites it like an academic article. Now, to begin with, I found that a little bit annoying to get on with. I don't really like footnotes, to be honest. When I'm reading, I find that they sort of break my flow of thought. You know, you just sort of like reading along, it's like, oh no, I've got to go down here and then I've got to go back up here, and it really did sort of, in that sense, remind me of being back at university and having to read in the way that they ask you to read, you know, because obviously all your textbooks have got referencing in. But I have to admit that by the time I got about halfway through this book, I actually didn't mind the referencing, sort of. I got used to it, and actually some of the stuff that Kubadora is actually writing down in the edit bit, like the referencing at the bottom, was actually quite helpful and quite useful. And I think there's even one bit where, like, there's a footnote that's the size of a whole page. So, you know, you get like a reference to a footnote part way down one page, and then you end up reading all the way down here and then all the way across another page, and then by the time you get to the end of it, then you've got to flip back a few pages to get back to where you were. But it was actually quite prevalent points that he was making in it. But I know some people really don't like reading footnotes in stories, so I thought I'd make it clear that there are footnotes in there, just, you know, because that might change your mind about whether or not you want to read the book. So I wasn't like too thrilled about it, but actually then I sort of got on with it, and I feel that because they're both scientists, they sort of approach this in a scientific manner, like you would if you were submitting something to a journal, which would have like footnotes and referencing in. So in a way it does kind of work, I think. So yeah, he's talking about how, you know, he's convinced his friend to do that, and how Norton's like one of his greatest friends. So we start off in 1924, when Norton is born. So we don't talk about like when he's a baby, but he talks about, you know, like when he's young, like 7, 8, 9 years old, and he's talking predominantly a bit about his parents and how his parents have shaped him. So we can sort of tell that Norton doesn't really like his parents. I mean, he doesn't say that he hates them, but he doesn't really seem to have much respect for them. His mother, he's not really nice to at all. Like, he has a twin brother called Owen, and they seem to gaslight the mother quite a bit. Like, they tell her, you know, she'll see them somewhere and then they'll pretend that they weren't there, but she's quite spaced out as an individual and we don't really know why. But she just sort of then accepts what they've said and then like looks into herself like, oh, I must have forgotten, stuff like that. And they play this kind of trick on her all the time, and then they laugh at her behind her back. So that was a kind of a bit shocking, because they never really talk about anything awful that she ever did to them in the childhood. It's just the fact that they had so little respect for her that they just wanted to wind her up, and they seem to get a kick out of that. And then the father, again, like, I don't think that Norton is very happy. His father has not sort of met his expectations of what he would want a dad to be. I think he finds his dad quite lazy, he's got no ambition, and he's just too content with his lot in life. So really the only person from Norton's childhood that stimulates him in a way is his Aunt Sybil, who's also a doctor. So he's kind of interested in the medical field, and she is the sort of person who has given him the idea that he would like to work in the medical field and given him sort of access to, you know, that. But I think his Aunt Sybil is about the only woman in the book that he has anything good to say about. So then, you know, his mother dies like when he's quite young, and he doesn't really seem that bothered by it either. So already, you know, we're starting off this book and we're like, you know, they're sort of suggesting he's a paedophile in the prologue, and already in the first chapter he seems to have a problem with his parents, and his parents don't seem to be negligent or horrible people. They just seem to have not met his expectations, and you know, he makes fun of them, and his relationship with his brother seems to be okay, but again, they don't entirely seem that close. So then it moves on, you know, and he starts talking about his time at medical school, like when he's training to be a doctor. And even there, like, he doesn't seem to get on with people that well. He doesn't really seem to have any friends. He doesn't really talk about dating in any way whatsoever. And then he finishes his residency, and he's basically now got to go out into the world and find a job. And he even says, you know, I don't want to work in a hospital, I don't want to be a GP or anything like that. And then one of his professors suggests that he goes onto this expedition, and there's an anthropologist who's running an expedition to this Micronesian island to study some tribe, and wondered if, you know, they had anybody, like any doctors that they could send from the university with the anthropologist, because he needed somebody to make notes on the people there, you know, from a medical point of view. So because Norton's a bit at a loss with what to do in life, he's like, yeah, sure, he goes. Now the interesting thing is he sees it as an adventure, and he's quite excited because he doesn't really know what he's getting himself into, and he didn't really like the idea of going into full-time work, and he wasn't really that attached to his studies either. I mean, he was like a mid-level student, you know, probably got the report card of could have tried harder. But he does realise before he comes back from his trip, actually, that the reason that he was kind of sent out there is because they were mocking him, they were making fun of him really, and trying to get rid of him. And he really doesn't realise that until he gets through the end of this trip. So that just sort of gives us an idea automatically at the beginning that he might not be the nicest person, because he just doesn't really seem to have anybody who's that bothered about him around him or seem to care. So then, you know, in 1950, so Norton would be like 26, he joins this expedition, and that's where he meets anthropologist Paul Tallant, and then Tallant has brought with him a student of his own called Esme. And this is really interesting because as soon as he meets Tallant, he is absolutely head over heels besotted with Tallant. He thinks he's really attractive and he can't stop thinking about him. And it's at this point, as the reader, you're thinking, oh, okay, so this man is probably homosexual then, because he's having these thoughts, because he never once mentioned a woman. And then, you know, in the next breath, he meets Esme, and Esme, you know, welcomes him to the expedition that they're going to. She's, you know, nice enough, doesn't really do anything nasty to him from what you can tell from the text. And within this like 5 minutes of them meeting each other, Tallant is also there, and he's very complimentary about Esme's skills and the knowledge that she has about the island that they're going to. And, you know, Norton straight away is, I decided I was going to hate her immediately. You know, and it's like, okay, so he's besotted by Tallant but wants to hate Esme straight away without her having really done anything. And again, you're getting this kind of vibe here that, okay, this is kind of like, you didn't like your mother and you're not liking this woman, you haven't really mentioned that many other women in the book. So I'm sort of forming a picture of Norton at this point, that he's quite misogynistic. And then that sort of only continues because after they've started travelling together, in the jungle, he finds some paper with some blood on, and he realises that Esme is on her period. So, you know, he's annoyed that she's left that in the jungle, which I guess I could understand. So he goes to sort of tell her off about it, but then it doesn't just stop there. It's not like he's just, you know, don't litter the jungle with stuff that might not break down. He just goes on, and I actually have prepared the piece that was actually written in this bit, so I can give you a sense of the kind of hatred that you sort of feel that he probably does have for women. So it says, I did not look at her, but around her seemed the sickening scent of menstrual blood, a tinnily feminine smell so oppressive that it was a relief finally to begin the day's climb and to find it vanishing slowly into the colours of the jungle, the odours of the jungle even. And from then on, I was unable to look at her without thinking of oozing liquids as thick and heavy as honey, but rank and spoiled, seeping from her every orifice. So, you know, it's like the very nature of her being a woman he seems to object to. You know, she cannot obviously help like having a period, and it's just the way that he's just banging on about it after she's just sort of, you know, acknowledged like what he said. So yeah, and he doesn't like Esme throughout the whole of this. They never have any kind of moment where they seem to get on with each other, and she never actually seems to be cruel to him in any way. She's quite dismissive of him, I think. But I think that that is because he's actually quite abrupt with her from the start, and he's not that nice to her. And I'm guessing she's probably picked up on the fact that he doesn't like her. And you know, she hasn't done anything to warrant that. So again, we have, you know, this. I just think he's a misogynist. So now at this point of reading, you know, we're not that far into the book. I'm like, okay, so he's suspected of being a paedophile. In fact, he probably is a paedophile. I'm thinking because, you know, he's gone to prison, so they must have found some evidence that showed that he was, and then he, you know, he's like making fun of his mum and trying to gaslight her. Now he hates this woman, you know, simply for existing and being a woman. By the look of it, like, you know, it's not very nice. This guy's a misogynist for sure. And I think that he is in some way jealous of Esme because he's imagining that she might have some kind of relationship with the anthropologist Talent. Now again, we never see any evidence of this throughout the whole book, but he periodically starts having images that he's seen them kissing each other or whatever in his head, and you know, and he doesn't like it. So he's very possessive as well of Talent, even though Talent has never at any point during this story said that he might be homosexual himself, done anything unprofessional with either of the two of them, like, you know, Norton or Esme, or said that he was in a relationship with Esme. He's just sort of been there and carried on doing the job that he was there to do. So, okay, so that sort of is talking about those relationships that he has with people. You know, I don't think he's the nicest person, if I'm honest. But he seems to settle into the island life okay, but this is probably partly because he doesn't speak the language that the locals are speaking. So the anthropologist, he's able to translate, which he does, and then they have 3 locals from the island, which is next to the island that they're on, and one of them does translation as well. So this is the only way that he can really speak to the local people because he doesn't know the language. So he can't really be like obnoxious to them, I don't think, because he just doesn't have the language skills to. And he's obviously interested in them, you know, as a people. So it's like when they get to this island and then they discover these elderly people who don't seem to be a part of any village, and they seem to not have the greatest motor skills. They seem to be forgetful. They seem a bit of a mess, like they don't know how to wash themselves, and they just don't quite seem all there. So initially this looks like, you know, well, is this what this tribe looks like on this island? And it's not. Like they carry on walking, and then they actually find like the main tribe, and these elderly people that they found outside had actually been cast out from the village, because essentially the fact that they are, I can't remember the exact name for it now, but have lost their mind. And as it turns out, these elderly people that have lost their minds are ones who have taken part in the turtle eating ritual because they had reached 60 years old, essentially. Now, this turtle is seen as like sacred on this island, which is why only people who reach 60 years old can eat this turtle. So this is like when they sort of are a bit confused because some of the villagers don't recognise some of the elderly people that they've brought, you know, back to the village with them. And this is really confusing to them at first, and then eventually they realise that these elderly people are so old that they were actually kicked out of the village before some of these other people in the village were actually born. And that's when they really begin to realise, okay, like this person has got to be more than like 80 years old or 100 years old. But physically, when Norton's like examining them, he thinks they're about 60 years old, because physically they look absolutely fine. It's just that mentally they're deteriorated. Now, the chief of this village won't let these elderly people stay in the village. They have to be camped away, like they've been cast out, so they're not allowed to come back in, you know. So they sort of Norton and Esme and Talon are living next to the village in a different sort of camp, but they're also caring for these elderly people, like islanders that they had found as they'd come onto the island, because they sort of, you know, they need caring for as well. You know, they don't have, the men don't have their spears anymore, so they're not actually able to hunt. All they're able to do is forage what they can find immediately in front of them. So the, you know, the anthropologist and Norton and Esme think it's important that they, you know, look after these elderly islanders while they're studying this village. So they stay there for about 6 months, and you know, they witness some different things happening in this village that obviously they would not witness happening in America. And again, this is where I think as a reader you're really forced to look into your own beliefs, because obviously the beliefs that we have about the things that we do are for the most part set in the culture that we are brought up in, and also the law system, you know, of the country that we're brought up in. And there's one really disturbing scene, essentially, where there's a hut, and it's called Hut 9, and the huts are all like really well laid out, and they all seem to have a certain reason, you know, for being there. And Norton's not really sure what Hut 9 is for until one night when they're having a ceremony, and there is a boy, and he's turning 8 years old. You know, he's 8 Oannas, and Oanna is the word they use for year, and what they mean is, like, obviously a year that's 400 days, because their calendar year is different to the calendar year that the rest of the world is currently following, like the Christian calendar, I'd say. So he's just turning 8 years old, but I guess in our calendar time he would be 9 years old, and he's taken into this hut with the chief, and then he's sodomized by the chief. He doesn't put up any fight, he just lies on the floor while the chief is doing that, and his parents are watching. No, his mom and dad are sat on a chair outside watching, you know, and like the whole village is watching this ritual happen. The chief finishes doing what he's doing, and then behind him there are another 8 men, like in the village, who one after the other go in and sodomize this poor young boy. And throughout the whole thing, he doesn't cry, he doesn't shout out, he just accepts it. Nobody tries to help him. Nobody, you know, views it in the same way that if we saw such a thing happening in this country, you know, we'd be calling 999 or 911 if you're in America, you know, we'd be absolutely horrified. And Norton's watching this ceremony, and he can't quite believe what he's watching. So he goes back to Esme, and he goes back to Talon, and he tells them about it, and quite frankly they like don't want to believe him. Esme's, you know, no, you must be making this up, like, you know, they can't have raped him. We didn't hear any noises or anything like that. So anyway, a couple of days later there is another boy who's turning 8 years old, who's 8 Oannas, and the same happens to him, and Esme and Talon actually witness the same ceremony happen to this boy. So they are now fully aware of, this is not in Norton's head, this did actually happen. Now Esme has the kind of reaction that I think most people, or a lot of people, are going to have when they see this. She's really angry about what she's seen. She's crying, like, after the fact that she's seen this thing, and even the next day she's in a foul mood and she's upset again, you know, and she's sort of saying to Norton and Talon, like, you know, they've raped him, that, you know, this is a gangbang, this is awful, like, you know, this is child abuse. And, you know, Norton's like, well, I'm not sure that we can call it rape, because this was consensual. Like, his parents were there, he wasn't fighting it, he didn't seem to be disturbed by it. This is, you know, one of the ceremonies that they have, and they live in a different culture to us. So Talon goes to ask the chief about it. He's like, what is this about? And the chief basically says, well, you know, he's old enough now that he's going to start being interested in this kind of activity, so we feel that the elder men in the village should teach the boys how to have sex. So that's why we do it. Who better than your elders to teach you? So this is why we all line up and we all do it. They don't do it with the girls, because apparently they don't need as much instruction, or they're not as sexual as the boys. I'm not really sure, but the whole thing in itself is just absolutely horrifying, really. I mean, you know, I think I read this scene and then I was like, and I was only halfway through the book, I was like looking for reviews on the book, thinking, you know, like people must have had opinions about this, and it's, you know, it's upsetting, really upsetting to think of something like that happening, because obviously in our culture consent can't be given by a minor because they don't have, you know, the they don't have the mental facility to make that decision for themselves, you know, and that's part of it. I mean, that's why people, you know, are arrested for having sex with minors. You know, if you're over a certain age and then you are, you know, engaging in that kind of activity with somebody who is simply not old enough to make that choice, that, you know, that's illegal. So, you know, and that's what we say in our law, and that's what we say in our culture. However, you do have to think to yourself, not that you're agreeing with this scene, because I don't think anybody could agree with this scene, but we have made that law and that decision in our culture based culturally on what we think is appropriate. So that doesn't necessarily mean that other people would come to the same decision about it. And, you know, it doesn't necessarily make us right and them wrong, or them right and us wrong. However, I'm glad that I don't live in a culture where that kind of ceremony is, you know, the practice, because I think that would, I think that would be upsetting, but if I had been brought up in that culture where that's all I had known, then maybe I wouldn't know any difference. And this is what I mean about Yanagara sort of posing moral and ethical questions in here, where, you know what you think you do about something, but then you do have to have a re-examination or a rethink of, why do I think this, and just because that's the law, actually why is that the law, and who decided that. Now, I also would say that across many countries and cultures across the world, it's illegal to have sex with minors, so it's not just the UK who have decided that this is not a good practice. It's obviously, you know, that is replicated across the world. So, you know, but it's disturbing to read. It's an upsetting scene, and I can understand why people were upset about that. But I also think that the scene was put in a way to pick a subject which is probably going to upset the most amount of people that you could, and getting them to examine their cultural belief at the same time. I think if they'd have, you know, if she'd have put in anything that was less, what's the word I'm looking for? Less likely to cause, like, if it wasn't such a emotive subject, like children is an emotive subject. Whenever people think there is abuse going on of children, people get very upset about that, you know. So if you want to get your audience to have a reaction to something like that is going to work. Whereas if you pick something that is less likely to upset people, then it might not have the same effect. And I really feel that part of the reason for this book is to get people to examine the values that they've held for so long, that they think they're comfortable with, and then get them to have a re-look at that. And so putting in some kind of scene like that actually was quite clever. So yeah, that's, I think, probably one of the most shocking things for me. But there's more to it as well. So these turtles, which obviously live on this island, very important to the islanders, and they have all these religious sort of beliefs around the turtle, and all these tales about, you know, what will happen if you essentially touch a turtle before you're 60, or you mistreat the turtles and things like that. And our, you know, Dr. Norton, he wants to take some of it back to America because he wants to study it. He realises it's having an effect on the population there. So obviously, if he just walked up to them and said, you know, I want a turtle, they wouldn't even let him touch one. So he's like creeping around in the night, thinking that he wants one. And then he bumps into a young lad who happens to be the lad who had celebrated his 8th birthday and had gone through this Aina Ina ceremony where he had been inducted by another 9 male members of their village, let's say. And him and Norton end up having sex together. We assume that's what happened. Norton sort of finds him in the woods, and then the boy tries to move Norton's hand, you know, onto his sexual organs, and Norton's like, oh no, this is wrong, and he moves it off, and then, you know, then from what we can tell, like, it just happens after that. And again, this is like a really shocking scene, and the way that Norton has kind of written about it, it's kind of like he was coerced into it by the boy. But again, I think this is Norton being a bit of an unreliable narrator here, because I think, as we know at the beginning of the book, Norton is obviously in prison for being a paedophile. So he wants to make himself seem as innocent as possible. So I don't think, you know, that he's going to be like, oh, you know, I found this boy in the middle of the woods in the dark, so I had him, you know. But also equally, you could say, like, this boy, is he damaged mentally from the ceremony that he's just been through? And, you know, is that why he was sort of trying to say to Norton, like, what he, you know, that he wanted him to touch him sexually? We don't really know. But I also think that unless a person had a proclivity to be with children, they would not suddenly be doing that in the woods just because a child was there and the child was suggesting it. I think that he must have already had a proclivity for liking young boys, but I do believe that this incident in the woods is probably the first time that he's ever acted upon that. And I think he's acting upon it because he's literally in the middle of nowhere, there's nobody to police what he's doing, this lad is alone, and it seems to be partially willing, you know, so he just does that. And what's interesting is that throughout the rest of the book, he kind of goes into a dream and thinks about this moment that he has with this young lad from time to time, and talks about like how he wished he could recreate it. So this is another reason why I think that it's definitely the first time he's actually acted upon that feeling that he might have had to be with children, because that's the time that seems to stick with him. So again, that's all very shocking. And then you know, he eventually does find these turtles, and he ends up killing one, and hacking off a couple of its body parts to, you know, sneak back to America with him. And in the, you know, in the process of doing this, he involves one of the guides from the island that's just over from the one that they're on, and they also revere these turtles, like they're a massive part of their culture too. And, you know, when he sees like what's happening, you know, he's pretty shocked by that. So Norton just decides not to talk to him about it. So anyway, he hides his turtle, and they're, you know, about to leave the island. So when they're leaving the island, they had a group of like 8 of these elderly people, like elderly members of this tribe who have been cast out from the tribe. You know, and they can't really look after themselves very well. So they're like, well, what are we going to do with them? The main village, the chief, he refuses to have them stay there because they've been cast out. They've been cast out for a reason. They don't want to care for them, and they believe that they have been tainted. That the turtle that they've eaten, now they've reached this madness. Essentially, it's a bad sign from the gods, you know. So then that's why they're not wanted in the village, because it would taint the village if they're in there. So they go off, you know, back to catch their boat, which is a day's, like about a week's long trek that they have to go through the jungle. So they take these 8 with them, part of the way, and then they think, well, we should take 4 with us back to, you know, the States, so that we can look at them and assess them medically properly. So they were going to leave 4 behind and take 4 with them. Now this poses some more ethical questions. So the 4 that they leave behind, instead of just leaving them, they actually loosely tie them together and then tie them to a tree. Now they leave all this food on the floor so that they can feed themselves for a short amount of time, and the assumption is because the bindings that they've put in are quite loose, that they'll be able to break themselves away and be okay. But you know, the question is, why would you tie them up in the first place? Like, they might die there. They might not have the motor functions to unpick the rope that they've been tied with. And so they leave them there. And then about a day, after they've been walking for about a day, this one guide who'd seen, you know, Norton kill the turtle, he's like, do you know what, like, I should have taken them, we should have taken them back to the other island to look after them. They can't look after themselves, they might die. So he's quite upset about this. You know, and like, well, no, they'll be fine, they'll break from the rope or whatnot. And before that they actually get to the shore, when they finish their trek with the 4 that they're actually taking, the guide who'd been really upset about this, he actually goes into the woods and kills himself. Like, he hangs himself off a branch. I think, you know, it was just all too much for him. You know, these people have come that he's guided to this island, and they've desecrated a turtle, which is going to bring bad luck on him anyway. And then he's been like forced into a situation where he's been caring for these elderly cursed people, and now he's essentially had to leave them in the middle of the woods to die, or he assumes that they're going to die, and none of that sits very well with him and his religion. And he feels that, you know, if he doesn't kill himself, then his family will be cursed back on the other island. So it's very, very sad. So the other 2 guides, they deal with his remains, and then they eventually make it off the island. Now, I find it interesting then, because this would have been in the 50s, I suppose, so I have no idea what border laws were like in America in the 50s, but they managed to take these 4 you know, natives off this island, and they managed to fly them into America, and then they, you know, smuggle them into a lab, and this lab is organised in a way to try and replicate a little bit the, you know, the landscape that they were in. So they don't have any windows, so they can't see outside and see any of the technology, because obviously they've never seen anything like that before, and it would have been very, very distressing. And obviously they're not really of sound mind either, so you can't really cope with a huge amount of change. But they put like leaves on the floor of this facility that they're sleeping in, and they try to replicate their diet as much as they can, but it's like futile. And over the years that they are in this facility, they quickly degenerate more and more and more and more, to the point where one of them's like been pushed around in a wheelchair because he's like lost the will to walk, you know. And Norton does say this degeneration, he thinks, has happened because they've been taken out of their, you know, their home habitat essentially, whereas before they were walking around barefoot in, you know, the sun, in the shade, and foraging themselves, and now they've got none of that. So it's, you know, and I think that degeneration mentally, actually you see that anyway in Alzheimer's patients. You know, if you try to take them out of, like, they say that if they, you know, if they've lived in a place for a really, really long time, it's best not to move house if you can help it, because obviously that makes it really hard for them, because they don't know where anything is, because they're doing everything almost off a long-term memory of where everything is and where they're meant to go and what they're meant to do. So if you completely change their surroundings, and it's very upsetting for them, which is essentially what they've done with these. So anyway, yeah, he gets back to his lab. Another doctor calls him up and says, you know, I want to replicate like your findings or whatnot. So they've both been doing, like, him and the other doctor have been doing some tests on some mice, and it proves that eating the turtle does expand the life massively, like 4 or 5 times the life that they would have had. So the eldest resident that they've actually got, that they've taken, like native they've taken from the island, appears to be about 300 years old, and the mice on the same time scale are sort of showing the same kind of lifespan, but they're also showing like they get to a certain point and then mentally they just utterly degenerate and lose the ability to speak, and can't, you know, really think for themselves anymore, and finding things like even walking or standing up difficult. But their bodies are showing to be really healthy, so their lungs are fine, they've got no degradation in their bone density or anything like that, but it's all a mental, you know, thing. So these papers all get written up, But Norton initially leaves out of these papers, you know, about the degeneration of the mind, because he's still trying to study that. So the first set of papers that he's publishing, and then the other doctor publishes after him, is about the fact that they've basically found the answer to immortality. So you can imagine when that gets published that every pharmaceutical company across the world is like, oh wow, like, you know, imagine the face creams, imagine the treatments that we could have if we had that turtle. And then there's a lot of scientists that want to go over there to study the turtles and the island and the people on the island. And I think that, again, this is interesting, I think that Norton was a little bit naive when he published his paper, because, you know, he had no intention of sending the world to this island. He was just reporting, you know, what he had studied, witnessed, and then got results from the tests, you know, that he'd taken. Whereas Tallon and Esme, they published their findings of, you know, the tribe that they found and, you know, the lives that they'd lived, but they didn't really talk about the turtle ceremony, or the fact that, you know, there were people who could live for like 300 years if they'd eaten this turtle. And Tallon actually does say to Norton that the reason that he didn't talk about that is because he knew what it would do. He knew that the world would then go to that island and it would ruin the island. But the thing is, he's an anthropologist, he's not a scientist, and Norton is a scientist and wants to advance science, you know. So again, we're probably a bit naive, but yeah, that's essentially what then happens in the book. Norton goes back to the island a couple of times to study the inhabitants and the turtles a little bit more over the years, but after a few years, essentially he then finds that when he gets there, the island has changed so much. It's lost a lot of the foliage. You've got camps of different pharmaceutical companies camping with, like, making fires and washing spread everywhere, and the locals are now wearing clothes, the locals are now trying to speak in English. You know, the wildlife has been decimated, the turtles become extinct because everybody, you know, wants them. And basically alcohol is introduced to the island, which destroys a lot of them. They didn't have like a great lifespan anyway, and now like quite a few people on, you know, the adjoining island to the main island are also exposed to all of this, so they're sort of dying because of like alcohol consumption, and it just becomes a huge mess really. And again, Norton does sort of think to himself through the book, you know, like, what is my responsibility in all of this? What is my, you know, what impact have I had? Now, Tallon and Esme blame Norton completely for the paper that he published, but I don't really think that it's that simple, because I think actually when you have found something which could advance science, you're going to tell the scientific community. I do think that the rest of the world also should have modified its behaviour. You know, I think the point is not to not know about these things and not know about scientific advancement, but, you know, it's like how capitalism will then essentially capitalise on that knowledge and destroy things. And I think, you know, there's all these other people that went to the island that can shoulder this responsibility, and I don't personally think that it's just Norton's, but essentially what this book, you know, is getting us to look at is colonialism, capitalism, pharmaceutical and science advancement, you know, and also treatment of human subjects. Because, you know, you've taken these 4 native people out of their environment, flown them to America, and again, I think Norton did this with the best of intentions, thinking, well, I can't really study them properly here on the island. But he didn't really think much to, okay, what's their actual diet, and would they be happy wherever I put them? And he had no facility set up for them when they got there, you know. And then they had to start wearing clothes and a bunch of things that they're not used to. And I don't think that he'd really thought that through. And there is, it does actually say in the book that the government started to crack down on how human subjects were treated. I think this was in the 70s and the 80s. And the 4 subjects that Norton taken from his island are obviously still alive, you know, when the book finishes, they're actually taken away from him and put in, I think, like an elderly care facility. But again, they're not doing very well in there. Essentially, they should have been left on their island, really, where they came from. But they can't put them back there now because the island is ruined as well, and it's just totally disrupted the natural flow of things for them. But yeah, it sort of begs questions about how you would treat human subjects, and with hindsight now, of how human subjects have been treated in the past. Obviously, we have a lot of stringent regulations around that if we use any human subjects in science. But it's easy now to look back and criticise what people may have done in the 50s or the 60s, but essentially they had not learned all those lessons then, and they probably had to make those mistakes before we could come up with all the correct ethical ways of doing these things. So whilst in a way this is terrible because Norton sort of removed these 4 people and ruined the rest of their lives, I don't think that he actually did that to ruin them. I just think he was naive and did not have the right people to talk to really about what he was trying to do, especially because he'd found this thing that essentially was a race against time then to publish his paper so that he would be rewarded with as the finder of this information and these people. So within the book then it talks about, he goes back to the island a few times, and as I've said, the island next to Iviu, which is I want to say Oivu, that's kind of become ruined as well, and there's a lot of children there whose parents have just sort of abandoned them, aren't bothered by them, aren't looking after them. And Norton, again, we've sort of mentioned that we think that he might be homosexual, but he doesn't really have any relationships with anybody at any point that he makes us aware of. But he decides he wants children, so he adopts children from this island, and then that sort of becomes his life for a good 30 years, and he adopts about 30 children over the time. And they're just sort of foisted on him when he goes to visit the island. Parents are like, well, we don't want this child. So he takes them back to the States. He has enough money, he's fairly rich, and so he feeds them, sends them to school, and they sort of grow up in batches. He's got like 5 or 6 that suddenly turn 18 and go off to college at once, and he's kind of relieved that they've gone. So, but for some reason then he goes out, because he must have empty nest syndrome, and then picks up a load more that are like 5-7 years old again, to go through the process again. But while he's doing this, he's saying to himself, I'm not really happy with this amount of children, I don't really want this many children, why is he doing it? And he does briefly allude back to that moment in the jungle that he had with that one lad, like the way that he looked at him, saying he's looking for the child who looks at him the same way. And you are thinking, well, what way exactly? Like when you were sodomizing him, or prior to that? Like, it's, so you do, yeah, it does make you think, that's a bit odd. Anyway, he gets criticised. A lot of people are like, why the hell do you want this many children? There's something wrong with you. And even his brother sort of has a bit of a go at him, about the way that he's sort of rearing these children. But Norton himself is like, there's nothing wrong with the way I'm raising these kids. They would have been just abandoned or dead on the side of the road if I hadn't taken them in, because they were like full of disease when I brought them here and covered in scabs. And I've done my best by them, and they've got, opportunity now. And he even has a fight, like one of his children actually argues with him about his name. He's called Victor, and he doesn't want to be called Victor. He's like, that's a very white Western name. You've tried to, whitewash me. I want a name that's like from Iviu. And again, Norton is like, oh yeah, like I'm used to this. Like some of them at some point, they always like have a go at me, and then when they're grown up and they come back and they realise, the opportunities that I've given them, then they always sort of apologise to me. And he's very arrogant, to be honest. He doesn't see himself as the white colonialist. Anyway, you know what I'm saying. He doesn't see himself in that way. He doesn't see himself as arrogant or misogynistic or anything like that. He just thinks that, he's doing his best and he's a saviour and everybody should like thank him. Now, his relationship with Owen doesn't get better either, and one of the like interesting things with this is at some point in the 50s he goes out for dinner with Owen, and Owen uses a metaphor to basically tell his brother that he's gay. So then when Norton's actually remembering this later on, he sort of makes fun of Owen in this way, not because Owen's gay, but he doesn't Like, he sort of makes fun of the metaphor that he'd used, and seems to disparage him for it, which I think is interesting, because obviously in the 50s being a homosexual in America was illegal, you know, and came with, you know, prison time if you were caught doing such a thing. So obviously Owen couldn't really out loud say, I'm gay. But at the same time, we know that, you know, Norton is gay, but he never mentions his sexuality throughout the whole book. And you kind of left as a reader thinking, are you in the closet? Do you realise that you are gay? Because we're not really sure that he does. However, he may also be leaving that out of the narrative, because essentially, you know, he doesn't want people to think bad of him because the book has opened up while he's in prison for committing sex acts against children. So it's a bit unsure what he actually thinks of his own sexuality, but definitely he could potentially be in the closet, and I found that very interesting that he criticised his own brother in the way that he tried to say that he was gay. So basically then this comes to the peak, which is where Victor, the child that we mentioned earlier, he makes an accusation that he's been sexually abused by Norton, and his brother Owen supports Victor in that accusation, and he actually buys him a lawyer, and he buys him a suit to go to court, and he even pays for his school fees while Norton's in prison, and he's fully believing, you know, Victor's story. So this just shows that the relationship, like the only relationship that Norton thought he had a close relationship with his brother, is not even a good relationship. Like, he can't even see it. It seems to me as a reader you can see that Owen doesn't really like Norton throughout the whole book, but Norton doesn't seem to quite get it. You know, so he, you know, ends because he's like been arrested. They've come to his house, and you know, he's like accused, and then he has to go and stand on trial. The book then ends. There's two more bits to the book then. We have a epilogue which is written by Kubadora, and in this epilogue essentially he's gone to pick Norton up from prison. This is in December 1999, and then in January 2000, when he's writing this epilogue, him and Norton have escaped. We don't know where they've gone, but essentially Norton didn't want to stay around for his weekly meetings with his social worker, and he didn't want to attend the paedophile, you know, classes that he was meant to go on to get him back into society. He wanted a fresh start. He wanted to go somewhere where people didn't know what he'd been accused of doing, and he just wanted to start his life again. Now, what's interesting to me in all of this is that all throughout, Norton doesn't have any desire for any other men apart from Talon. Talon is like the one that he is beside about. He doesn't mention Kubadora, never mentions him in any capacity of having that kind of relationship with him or fancy him or anything like that. And in Norton's last entry into this, you know, retelling of his life, on the last page he's actually dreaming that he's gone back to the island. It hasn't been taken over by people trying to break it apart for science. So it is as it was when he first got there, and he meets Talon, and then they're together in the jungle. Now, nobody actually knows what happened to Talon, because Talon went missing like while he was researching on the island. So and he didn't go missing at a time when Norton was there. He went missing on one of his own expeditions there. So nobody really knows what's happened to him, but my feeling is that he probably just wanted to escape from it all and kind of realised what had happened as a result of the first trip that he'd organised to this island, and then this island has become destroyed. Esme, the other researcher, she actually commits suicide. So yeah, both of them are no longer in the picture, and Norton's the only one that's left. But yeah, Norton still daydreams about Talon, and I feel like it's always been Talon to him, and the only other sexual encounter that he thinks about is, well, only sexual encounter he thinks about is with that boy in the jungle. So he's never once made you think, oh, he wanted to go out with his research assistant Kubadora or anything like that. Whereas Kubadora, at the start of the book, you can tell he's in love with Norton. Thinks Norton can do no wrong, and in this he's like happy that they're starting their life together. He's written his wife a letter telling her that there's money for the children, but basically she's not going to see him again. So we can only assume that Cupidora has now come out of the closet to go on the run with Norton. And I definitely think that it's a love thing from Cupidora's point of view, just from the way that he talks about Norton. You know, you wouldn't just give up your wife and your kids and your career to chase after somebody if you weren't in love with them. That would just be insane. However, I don't think that Norton is in love with him. I think that Norton is using him, because obviously it makes things easier if you're going to disappear into obscurity if you've got somebody who supports you and believes in you with you. Now, you know, you then have to think to yourself, what kind of person is Cupidora? And in his epilogue, one of the last things he writes is, okay, I'm going to include a chapter in here that I wasn't sure I was going to include, but I just want to include it because it shows that Norton loves in his own way. And then we get the missing chapter, which is Norton basically admitting to having not only sexually assaulted the son Victor, who accused him of sexually assaulting him, but having had sex with some of his other adopted children, and he doesn't seem to think there's a problem with it. And essentially he had sex with Victor to show him who was in charge, really, and but also said to Victor the reason why he was doing it was because he loved him. So that kind of solves the mystery. Like, I would say at the beginning of the book I was like, I'm pretty sure he's a paedophile because he's gone to prison, so they must have had some evidence for it. But now Norton's actually admitting, yes, I've done this, and I've done it with other children. And Cupidora is still willing to give up his life and go on the run with Norton. So you're thinking, like, not only is Norton a very flawed, awful character, but Cupidora is also extremely flawed. And, you know, there could probably be a separate book, or had been several chapters just following this guy to understand how twisted he is in the head to think that what Norton has done is acceptable. I mean, you know, because he seems genuinely shocked in the prologues that when he's writing that all these people have abandoned Norton. Yet he actually knows at this point that Norton is actually guilty of, you know, the charge that has been levelled at him. So, you know, that in itself is just absolutely shocking. So, you know, overall, we've got a book where our main character is not really that likeable. And the guy telling his story is not really that likeable. Like, they're both very, very, very complex characters, I think. And I think, you know, after all the questions I said that it posed earlier, there's another question I've got as well, is how easy child trafficking into America seemed to be in the 70s. I don't know if that's actually the case, but otherwise I'm sort of thinking, how the hell did Norton get 30 children that he just seemed to randomly go over, get on a plane and then take them back into the States, and in the States they just let him walk back into the country with these children and they're adopted. I think things are much, much harder now. But yeah, you know, shone a bit of a light on that as well. Obviously this is a fictional story, so I don't know how true that is, but anyway, I think that another question for me out of this, apart from all these ethical questions around what the characters are doing, is that we've got our characters from the island, the natives, who, like the elderly ones who'd eaten the turtle, who, like, one of them's like 300 years old now, and that's massive. But part of the point of this is you can have immortality, like this long-lasting life, but essentially it's only your physical body that is able to cope with this longer life, and actually your brain utterly degenerates, like, you know, because it doesn't prolong that, it doesn't prolong your brain tissue or it running or anything like that. So towards the end of the book, when they're talking about these subjects and what state they're in, and Cupidora says yes, they're still alive, but the one of them, who was 300 years old, she had actually been registered as brain dead. They could find no brain activity going on, but her body was perfectly fit and healthy. So again, we have questions here about, you know, the ethics of keeping someone alive who is essentially brain dead, but physically, you know, is capable. So I think that Yanagara here, she's written a book that is has some very intense questions in there's a lot of soul searching you have to do in yourself. And I think, you know, in a way it's you could object to it because she's used two characters to present these ideas to you who are just, you know, the pits when it comes to humanity. I mean, Norton is not a nice guy, and neither is Cupidora. You know, and they're the ones that are making you, you know, think about all this. But I don't think that that really changes much. I think that she wrote some really complicated characters, and I think one of the other things that she's sort of trying to say with this book is that you can have the worst of the worst, like Norton, you know, but the worst of the worst don't always have, you know, that doesn't mean that they don't give anything to the world academically or in relation to their career. So while Norton is, you know, nobody would want to respect him as a paedophile, he won a Nobel Prize. I mean, that's one of the highest awards that can be conferred on a person. And in real life, yeah, like, I'm guessing, you know, there's paedophiles out there before they got convicted and everything who were being members of society and contributing to whatever field of work that they worked in. Doesn't mean that they're not educated in any way. It's just they've got a proclivity, which most people frown upon and is illegal, especially in you know, most countries. So, you know, it's a difficult question to ask yourself, really, because it's like, well, is that person's work worthwhile when they themselves, you know, have committed some abominable crimes? So, you know, I definitely think this is literary fiction. As I say, when I looked on the internet, there was like a variety of different things that it fit into, and I'm definitely thinking it's literary fiction because the actual plot where they're going onto the island to study the turtle and the people is actually quite a small bit of the book. I think that the plot is designed to move Norton's life story so that he can narrate around that, but actually we're talking about the start of his life and the end of his life as well, and it's really about his character flaws, his psychology, and, you know, who he is as a person, and I think at the end, you know, who Cupidora is as a person, and then also to get the reader to examine their thoughts on things. So I thought, you know, I really wanted to do a sort of look into this book and sort of talk about it, because, as I say, I was only halfway through it and I was looking online for what other people were trying to say, and then as soon as I finished it I was looking online for what people wanted to say, because it just affected me so much. I mean, I never heard of this book like 6 weeks ago, and then, you know, I sort of ordered it because it came in a bundle with another two that I was sort of interested in, and then accidentally started reading it, got sucked into it. I thought, wow, this is one of the strongest pieces of work I have read all year, you know, and December's not up yet, so there could be something else, but definitely I think that I would give this a 5-star. I've had a think about it, so I was thinking, do I want to give it like a 4.5 or do I want to give it a 5? And I actually just think that the execution is so good, and, you know, the kind of questions, you know, and discussion and debate that could come out of this book is just massive. And the fact that it's a debut novel as well, it's just, yeah, it's really, really good. Now, my assumption is if you have watched this summary of The People in the Trees, you've probably read this book and you wanted to see what I had to say about it, because you've probably got a lot to say about it yourself. So by all means, please leave a comment down in the comment section if you want to comment on the book as well. If you haven't read the book and you've sat through all of this, like, well, thank you very much. But what I would say, if you're thinking about reading it, there's trigger warnings for so many things in there, so definitely, you know, there is child sexual assault in there for one, so if that makes you very, very uncomfortable, and then that might not be the book for you. Now, it doesn't take up a huge portion of the book, but obviously the way that we feel about the character is based on those small scenes of those things happening, so just bear that in mind. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that you've enjoyed my summary and my discussion, and as I say, please add your own comments below if you want to get involved as well. Please like this video and subscribe so you can see more of my videos in the future. Thanks for watching. Bye!